In Minnesota, Don Shelby will be joining us a little bit later on. In studio right now is a librarian from Shattuck, Richard Kettering, and thanks, Richard, for stopping by.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I really do appreciate this. Of course, we used to visit all the time when we had the Tree Frog.
Yeah. Tree Frog Music Festival, but I'm involved at Shattuck-St. Mary's with their Performing Arts series. We've got two of them there. We've got one called the Fessler-Lampert Performing Arts Series, and then we have another one that's kind of spun out of Fessler-Lampert, which is called the Acoustic Roots Music Series. And both of these series are open to the public, and they're held in New Hall Auditorium. We call it Historic New Hall Auditorium.
And it is. It's a gorgeous place.
It's in Shumway Hall, built in 1887, and the theater seats 425 people. It's an all wood interior. It's a beautiful place for music and for spoken theater.
And it's perfect for this Thursday's event that Don Shelby's involved in. It's a one-act performance about Mark Twain.
Don Shelby does a one-man show. He calls it an evening with Mark Twain, and he takes on the whole appearance of Mark Twain, spends a lot of time in makeup beforehand. After the show, he actually comes out and does a talk back with the audience as he sits on the stage and takes off his makeup and transfers back into Don Shelby.
This is the perfect setting, though. You mentioned 1887. I mean, this is right in Mark Twain or Samuel Langhorne Clemens' time frame.
When Mark Twain was on his lecture tours, it was right at the time when this building was new. So I think for the audience members, for many it might seem like they're traveling back in time.
Yeah, I think it'll be very cool. I'm looking forward to visiting with Don Shelby about his depiction of Mark Twain.
Don's a real Mark Twain scholar. He's studied him for years, and well, when he's on air here in a little bit, I'm sure we can ask him about some of those things.
Sure. When did Fessler-Lampert start, Dave?
We've been doing this for almost 30 years now. It's an endowed series, and most of our shows are on Thursday nights, and we're able to open them to the public, charge a modest admission fee, and all the artists that are coming for Fessler-Lampert shows are usually doing some kind of residency work with students. For example, Don is going to be meeting with several English classes, American literature classes, and those kids will get a up-close experience with him the day of the show.
Tickets for this are $22 for adults, $12 for students, right?
Yes, and our ticket office number is 507-333-1620. So I'd encourage people to call in and make a reservation and get their tickets, because we think that we're going to be very close to a sellout for this.
It should be a sellout.
I think so.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question. Before we head on a market update, you wanted to plug another event coming up.
Oh, there's all right. So the evening with Mark Twain with Don Shelby is on Thursday, October 15th. This Thursday. We've got another Fessler-Lampert event coming on Thursday, December 3rd, the George Maurer Group. And George Maurer is really a Minnesota music treasure. He's a jazz pianist, and he pulls together some of the best jazz musicians in the area and puts on a nice show. Thursday, December 3rd.
And those tickets, $15 for adults and $9 for students. Wow. Great deal.
Good. That'll sound really nice in that theater.
Yeah, really, the acoustics are very good.
Right, and even though it's in the holiday season, it's not a holiday show, but he said he'd probably throw in a few holiday tunes.
Why not?
Sure.
There's nothing wrong with that.
December 3rd.
Don Shelby will join us in our next segment.
Mary's, and we've got a lot of arts events that are going on. New Hall Auditorium is a busy place. Our musical this fall is Annie, And we have our own arts events, but we also have these Fessler-Lampert events there. And so that's how you get to it, s-sm.org, and then arts events at s-sm. And our box office number, again, is 507-333-1620. So this Thursday night, October 15th, Don Shelby's coming with his one-man show, An Evening with Mark Twain. He just takes the stage in character as Mark Twain, and it's really kind of a recreation of what Mark Twain used to do. Mark Twain would travel the lecture circuit back in the late 1800s, and a lot of times he'd be invited to speak at men's clubs and colleges and universities, that type of thing. Some people say that these were very humorous presentations, and some people will point to Twain as the father of stand-up comedy.
No kidding.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't intentionally, completely a comedy type routine, but it was. Twain was a real humorist, and
right.
So it was very entertaining.
Very witty guy.
Yes.
But he would also talk about politics, right?
He was a satirist. He'd talk about politics, and he was well-traveled, and, he had gone on a couple of European tours, and he would talk about things that were going on in the world.
Yeah, I read his bio on history.com last night. Very long bio. Talked about his life and made a lot of trips, lived abroad for a long time. Mm-hmm. Then when his wife was failing in health, they moved to Italy.
Right.
I was in Italy in April, so it was kind of cool to read a little bit about that.
Right. Well, at that time when people would travel abroad, they'd go there and they'd stay a couple of months. So
I think our phone is ringing, Dick.
KDHL, is it John? Yes, hang on just a second. We'll get you on here. Hang on.
And I think Don Shelby is with us right now. Good morning, Don.
Hey, Gordy, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic. The question is, how are you?
Never better in my life.
That's cool. We love to hear that. So Dick and I, Dick, you can say hi to Dick. He's here in the studio.
Hi, Dick. How you doing?
Good. Good to hear you.
Good to hear you.
Yeah. He'll be in Faribault on Thursday as Mark Twain. He says you literally turn into Mark Twain.
Well, I feel like I have not only an affinity for him, but I've read so much in my life about him. Biographies, his own autobiography, and every one of his books, plus everything that anyone said about him contemporarily in newspaper accounts of his appearances. I feel like I not only have an affinity for Mark Twain, but sometimes I feel like him.
That sounds awesome. So Thursday night, people can come to New Hall Auditorium and see you. And Dick was telling us that after the show, you actually come back on stage as Don Shelby.
I come back on stage as Mark Twain. Then there will be a table there with all the stuff that is required to remove the makeup, and have a conversation with the audience as I come back out of character into myself. So they will watch me remove all the makeup that takes 2 hours to put on and about a half an hour to take off. But it's kind of fun. And it violates kind of the rule of the theater, because once you create a character, and you should never break that fourth wall, they say, that because you see, when you watch on a stage, you see 3 walls of the set, and the fourth wall is the wall between the audience and the character. And I've been told by many, many people don't do it, but I find that when I have done it, people really, really enjoy it. So we're going to have an opportunity to do that, and then we invite anyone who buys tickets and sits in the audience to stick around after the show. And that's only a few minutes after the show. I'll walk back on stage and begin the process of taking the makeup off.
A couple hours to put on. How often do you do this?
About 40 to 60 times a year.
Wow. Now, Dick was saying earlier that you would know, because you've studied a lot, obviously, about Samuel Langhorne Clemens or Mark Twain, if he had ever been in Minnesota.
Oh, yeah, many times. In fact, he writes about Minnesota in one of the last 4 chapters of Life on the Mississippi. He always considered the upper Mississippi River to be one of the most beautiful places that he'd ever been in his life. Most people had written about and he had practiced as a riverboat pilot on the southern 2/3 of the Mississippi River. So he knew the basically Galena, Illinois, Cairo, Illinois, all the way down, and he had gotten up as far as Keokuk. There were rapids at Keokuk, and difficult to travel for some of the big steamboats. But that's why there was a trade between Iowa and Minnesota that had a lot of packet boats on it, because they ran that upper Mississippi River section and then down to Minnesota a little ways. But yes, he was there. He wrote about White Bear Lake, and not too flatteringly, by the way, because he was reading from a document that was espousing the great beauty of White Bear Lake, and he went after the name quite a little bit. But he was in Red Wing. He was all the way up in Crookston on his last world tour, from which the book Following the Equator was written. And he was doing that to pay off debts that he had incurred in his lifetime. The last 2 years, so he did Crookston, he did Duluth, he was in Minneapolis quite often. And there are contemporary accounts which I have gotten from the Historical Society of the newspaper reportage of Twain's visits in each of those cases. So yes, the answer, Dick, he was in Minnesota and often.
Yeah, we were kind of hoping he'd be at Newhall Auditorium, because it was built, what year did you say, Dick?
1887.
Here in Faribault.
Well, that's perfect. That is absolutely perfect, because that's only 5 years after he wrote Huckleberry Finn.
Things that I think really speaks to his character is he had a number of financial downfalls and a big bankruptcy.
Yep.
But then later he recovered, and he went back and paid off all of his bankruptcy debts, even though he wasn't legally required to do that. I think that really says something about Twain, the man.
Let me make you think even greater about him. He didn't go bankrupt. He refused to file bankruptcy. He went to a man named Rogers at Standard Oil, and he had what is, by today's equivalency, $22 million in debts because of the failure of a publishing house and because of investments in a linotype machine and some other things. And so he had gone to friends, and he had borrowed what is in today's money about $22 million. So he owed that amount of money. Can you imagine owing $22 million? And then being advised to file bankruptcy, and he refused. He said, I'm going to pay back everyone, not 10 cents on the dollar, but every penny that anyone has ever entrusted to me. And he did something that very few people realize he did. He hated, more than anything in the world, lecturing. He hated the touring. He hated being away from his family. He hated the railroads. He hated the community committees that would always take him around and show him the town. He just disliked touring. And he would tour about 5 months out of the year. But the only way that he could make up the $22 million was by going around the world on a lecture tour for 2 years and lecturing every night. And he said, if that's the way it has to be done, that's the way it has to be done. Because my big money books, the big books that would make his fortune, those had already been written. And he would never make the money off books again the way he did off of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. And so he did go on that tour. It took him 2 years to travel around the world, South Africa, Australia, all the way up and finishing up in England. And about 2 weeks into his tour in England, his last stop, Rogers wired him from New York and said, "You have now paid off everyone to the penny." Just remarkable.
That's amazing. That's really fantastic.
Terrific
so
story.
You realize why I kind of like the guy. Man stands by his honor and by his debts, and he's likable in that sense. But he also, one of the reasons I like him is that he's irascible, and also the most courageous writer in American literary history. He was the first person in history to ascribe to an African American the same depths of emotion that a white person felt. And he did it at a time when slavery was still a sore point, but he probably would have failed if he had come out as Samuel Clemens and made these pronouncements that blacks were the equals to whites. But he didn't. He put those words in the mouth of an ignorant, unwashed, underfed 12-year-old by the name of Huckleberry Finn. And when people realized that even a ignorant child knew more than they did, the world began to change.
Isn't that incredible? Now,
Yeah.
later on, correct me if I'm wrong, Don, but later on, wouldn't he write another book that tackled this too?
Well, he wrote many of his books. Putting Ed Wilson was a great book, and he loved the idea of twins or mistaken identity, and he had 3 or 4 books that used this. Prince and the Pauper. People don't realize he wrote Prince and the Pauper, a Connecticut Yankee. But he used this theme over and over again. And when he would speak publicly, and he did, he was the most sought-after after-dinner speaker and probably the first stand-up comedian. That's the reason they present each year the Mark Twain Award to the best stand-up comic in America, because he, even though he was called a humorist at the time, by today's standards, he would probably be more like a Mort Saul. He would be someone who not only was funny, but he was satirical, and he popped a lot of balloons. And then in the Gilded Age, he did the same thing, where he made fun of all the rich people in the world, and so it kind of presaged the one percenters that are in the news today. And he disliked Congress a great deal, as most people by the polls suggest today dislike the way Congress is behaving. He called Congress that grand old benevolent national asylum for the helpless.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Don, I've got a question for you. In
Sure.
some of the sets of books that I have in Shattuck Library, there's a pretty bold statement right at the front about it being the only authorized edition of his works and so on. And I understand that Twain ran into a lot of intellectual property rights issues. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, he was the first author who testified before Congress on America's copyright laws, because he wanted to seek protection from those people who would just take his writing and set up their own publishing house and get the print stock and boards and publish and sell the books. And his books were sold by subscription primarily. There were traveling salespeople back in the day who would go door to door and like a vacuum cleaner salesman. And people look forward to these visits from these not encyclopedia salespeople, but they say, we have these books available, and as soon as it's published, then you'll get your copy. And you could pick whether it's Morocco or gilt or calf or in cloth. And people would buy by subscription. Well, the copyright laws were so thin back in the day that as soon as he got the book published at a publishing house, Canadian, Japanese, European, British primarily, would just take the plates basically and publish their own version and make all the money and give him none. And so he was trying to get the copyright laws fixed and made a great deal of headway in that case and protected authors throughout modern history by changing the copyright laws of America.
So in an evening with Mark Twain, Don, are you reflecting on your life, your entire life as Mark Twain?
Yeah, there's a portion that is well known to everyone where he is speaking about the river. But I take the audience through basically the entire course of his life, leaving out some of the personal stuff that I've just been sharing with you. He doesn't get up in front of an audience and say, poor me. He talks about the interesting things and the funny things that have happened to him. So everything from the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii, to the river, to the time that he spent in Connecticut, because this is an interesting thing. Most people believe he's just a Missouri kid. But the fact is that he was only in Missouri until he was 17. And then he spent the rest of his life on the East Coast or in Florence, Italy, or in Rome, or in Paris. He lived in Germany for a period of time when his finances were down and it was much cheaper to live in Europe. So he spent probably 12 years of his life in Europe. And then he came back home to great acclaim and continued to write and writing for magazines and serializing a lot of his later work and was picked up by Harper's. And Harper's put out a lot of the smaller books that he wrote in his later life. But this evening, they'll get to know Mark Twain pretty well.
Dick, you would know more about this than I. Some libraries in the nation have banned The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn for usage of...
Yeah, the N-word, as we refer to it. Yeah, and it's very unfortunate that they... usually it's when it's a required reading in a class, but you still find it in libraries. Huckleberry Finn and The Adventures of Tom Sawyer.
Right. So, Don, I just wanted to get your take on that.
Well, of course, it's silliness that any book would be banned. Of course, I spent 50 years of my life fighting for freedom of speech and freedom of the press, and so you would notionally understand why I would oppose any idea like this. But having spent a lot of time in high schools and junior high schools where Huckleberry Finn is being taught, I understand from a professional perspective, and perhaps I think Twain would too, that having this book taught in your middle years of high school is probably not the smartest thing, because if you read Huckleberry Finn as a young person, you will have one reaction to it. When you read it when you're 40 or 50 years old, you'll have a completely different reaction to it. And that was a big debate at the time, whether this was a book, was this juvenile literature, or was this a book for adults to read? And it's still an argument that goes on today, because what I find in, if you're in a school setting, a secondary school setting, and you assign Huckleberry Finn, the conversation that ensues in class will be either trying to explain why the use of the N-word was appropriate then but not appropriate now, and is this book racist or is this book not racist, and completely misses the point, totally misses the point of what Twain was trying to say when he wrote the book, that slavery is awful, that the mistreatment of blacks was awful. And in order to communicate through the voice of an ignorant person, they have to speak and say ignorant things. And that's where the appearance of that word shows up. Not in direct quotations from Samuel Clemens, but coming out of the mouth of an ignorant person. But that's not seen. It's just people are stopped by the word, and as they should be today, they're stopped by the word. But that's not the book, Huckleberry Finn. It is not what Huckleberry Finn did socially to the conscience of America. And that conversation is missing in the discussion because everyone is focused on this other question of whether this is racist. Well, yes, it's racist by today's standards, but was it racist then? Did it have a positive effect on changing America? Yes, of course it did. And is it worth reading today? Yes, of course it is, as a historical document demonstrating that a man of incredible courage was able to take on an institution like slavery, which, though it was outlawed, still in essence existed in the mind of two-thirds of the United States, if not the whole of it, and still haunts us to this day. And it took remarkable courage on the part of this individual to say these things, to speak truth to power.
Thanks, Don, for being with us today. We look forward to seeing you on Thursday in Newhall Auditorium.
It's going to be fun, and it's great to be back there. I get to put my makeup on in the dressing room where Marlon Brando scrawled his name. So I feel like I'm in a company way over my head, both Mark Twain and Marlon Brando.
Well, thanks again, Don. I really appreciate it. You have a super day, okay?
All right, and I'll see you there, Dick, and then I'll enjoy going to the literature classes and having a conversation with these students, too.
Yeah, thanks, Don.
All right, talk to you later.
Don Shelby with us this morning on AM Minnesota. He does have Mark Twain down, doesn't he?
He sure does. He's a real Mark Twain scholar. So if you want to get tickets for that show, you can call our box office. The number's 507-333-1620. 507-333-1620. Shattuck-St. Mary's.